Welcome, Zoomers. I'm Captain Jim Sharp. Welcome to the world famous Sail Power Steam Museum, created by founder Meg Sharp and myself, Jim Sharp. Wonderful, wonderful museum on the south end of Rockland. A lot of you have seen these Zoom programs before, so I won't dwell at this moment on the museum. I'll dwell on it a little later during the commercial, but I want to tell you a little bit about how all of this came to be. So many people come into the museum and they ask me, Captain, how did you start this museum and why did you start this, and all that kind of stuff. And I say to them, well, you know, I was retired. This was back about 2017. I was retired. My wife and I were sailing all over the world, having a wonderful gay time of it. And sometimes on a Sunday, we would take a ride around town and go up to the top of Mount Batty and look out over the Penobscot Bay and all the little vistas along the way and spend the afternoon having a little taste of the local culture of Rockland, Camden, Mid-Coast area. Well, this one particular Sunday, I decided we'd go down to Rockland. And I'd heard that this property was for sale down there. So we went down to the Snow Marine Park down the south end, and we pulled in down there and looked across, and here was this beautiful set of buildings right on the waterfront there. It looked kind of deserted. It looked kind of unkempt. A couple of shingles falling off of it and that kind of thing, and kind of dirt around, trash around in the yard. And I turned to Meg and I said, you know, babe, that's the site of the old snow shipyard. The old snow shipyard, she says. Yes, I said, the old snow shipyard. More vessels were built right here. This was a hubbub back in the 1800s. Rockland was a beehive of activity. There were shipyards all around the whole harbor here. And the hub of the whole schmear was this snow shipyard. The snow shipyard, they cranked out more vessels out of this yard than any other in Rockland, than any other in Maine, and most of New England. It was a very prolific shipyard. Back in 18, that of course, the whole of the Maine coast was that way. The whole of the Maine coast was just an amazing array of wonderful sailing vessels coming in and out this whole northern terminus. You know, 1891, 1892, 3, and counting, Rockland was the fourth largest seaport in the United States. You can't believe that, but it's true. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Rockland, Maine. Just an amazing place. And the hub of it all was the snow shipyard. Oh, she says, isn't that interesting? She said, what's going to happen to that property? I said, well, I don't know, but you know, it would make a wonderful museum, wouldn't it? She said, a museum? What do you mean a museum? I said, well, it's hallowed grounds. It's where this snow, all these vessels were built. It's just wonderful for a ship, for a museum. She said, well, what would you do with the museum? Well, I said, I don't know, but I think I'd be able to put my feet up on the desk and lie and brag to everybody, and they'd have to believe me because I'm the oldest thing around. Well, she said, for crying out loud, you're 75 years of age. You want to start a new career now? I said, well, you're right. And we have to be really sure that this is the right thing to do. So I guess we'll take a coin and we'll toss it up and see if it comes out right. So I said, if I'm going to flunk retirement, I want to make sure it's the right thing to do. So I didn't have a silver dollar and I didn't have a half a dollar, but I had a quarter. So we threw the quarter in the air and it went round and round with deliberation. It came down and landed tails up. Oh my God, unequivocally, no, we should not do this thing. But we went and did it anyway. And it was the start of the world famous Sail Power Steam Museum. This museum was born at that particular time. We negotiated, put our cards on the row, and by gee, we were able to buy that property, start this museum, and it has been going ahead faster and faster all the time. Well, tonight, we're going to have a wonderful program tonight. Don Wilding and the Great Gale of 1898. The Great Gale of 1898. My God, what an incredible gale that was. The Portland Gale of 1898. The gale of all gales, really. It set the benchmark. It was the paw post. Everybody talks about the gale of 1898. When they have a little breeze of wind around there now, all the old fellows say, well, this isn't nothing compared to what it was in 1898. And we're going to know all the gory details of all the difficulties and the vessels lost and so on with Don wilding. But before we do that, I want to connect the dots. I want to connect a few dots to the snow shipyard, if I may. Let's roll back one of these pages here and take a look at this beautiful little tugboat. Did you ever see such a cute little tugboat? Look at that perky little thing. Got a pilot house on her with oval windows. Isn't she cunning? She got a great stack on her, belching out black smoke, and the old steam whistle belching out steam. And he was out by the race there, the northern part of Cape Cod. Calm, calm day. Oh my God, it was calm. A thick day. One of these days with oppressive atmosphere, but no wind. No wind at all. Well, he thought I'll be able to get a tow going into Boston now. So he was laying around there waiting for a tow, and this old vessel was drifting out there. She was wallowing away in the sea. Tugboat came around the stern of her, came up alongside the quarter deck. He jumped out of the pilot house. He got his megaphone out, and he shouted over to the old crusty captain standing at the wheel, "Hey, Cap, you're not going to make it very far today. You're not going to do well without any wind like this. Yeah, let me hook on to you. We'll tow you into Boston. I'm going that way anyway. Won't cost you very much." The old captain sauntered over to the rail, and he looked down with great disdain on this guy. And he says, "Sonny," he said, "I know your type. You'd rob my hide if you had the chance. You'll not be taking my hawser today. Tomorrow's Sunday. I can't unload anyway. I'm going to wait until Monday, and on the morning breeze, you'll see me coming into Boston Harbor with a great bone in the teeth of her." That's sailor talk for a good snoot of headway. Oh my God, the old captain on the tugboat, he just a little dejected. He got back into his boat, put her into gear. He had a 500 horse two-stage engine in her, compound engine in her, and she answered to that great big propeller and wandered off over the horizon. And he looked around and he saw another set of mastheads. And he thought to himself, "Hey, here's another vessel. I wonder if I can talk her into it." So he heads over there, by G. And it turns out that it's this beautiful schooner. She's wallowing around in the groundswell trying to make her way to Boston. And he looks at it through his binoculars and he says, "That looks like a snow vessel from the snow shipyard in Maine. I think I've seen that vessel before." He gets over a little closer to her. Sure enough, my gosh, what a beautiful vessel it is, loaded with heavy granite from Maine, bringing building blocks down to Boston, down almost to her scuppers there with no breeze at all. She isn't leaned over and heeling over at all, and her scuppers are almost awash anyway. She is so loaded down. Well, as he approached, he saw the men starting to do things. They had men running up aloft. They're furling the topsails. The men were out on the bowsprit. They were taking in the jibs. He came around the stern of this beautiful vessel. He looked up, and sure enough, on the transom, there it was emblazoned across the stern, Lavinia Snow, Rockland, Maine. The snow vessel from Rockland, Maine. Oh my God, he thought, I know that vessel. I've seen her in the news. She was launched only 5 years ago, launched from the snow shipyard where all these old vessels were launched. There were so many of these vessels. Here is the launching of the Lavinia Snow. The launching of Lavinia Snow with a whole great crowd around her and the tugboat there blasting off his steam whistle, getting ready to pick her up after she makes her debut into the water. Here at the hub, the snow shipyard, the hub of shipbuilding in Rockland, Maine, the Lavinia Snow was built. Well, excitedly, the tugboat operator ran around the stern. He came over. He was about to open his mouth and shout to the skipper when the skipper shouted down at him, "All right, Sonny, go up there, grab my hawser, get me into Boston. Don't dally. Go get it. Get me there just as quick as you can get me there." That captain, he saw something in the air. He looked up at the sun. There was a dog around it. There were these high cirrus clouds. The atmosphere was so heavy it was leaden against your skin. There wasn't any wind, but you could almost feel the weight of the atmosphere around you. He wanted to get into Boston just as fast as he could get there. The little tugboat ran up, grabbed a hold of the hawser, put it on the bit behind the pilot house, took a little strain on it. Oh my God, this vessel was some heavy. She was a heavy girl. My God, he brought that hawser up out of the water. It shook like an old dog. shook the water out of it, came up tight, and then he slammed the throttle all the way down to the bridge deck. That 500 horse compound engine went chug, chug, chug. The smoke billowed out of her stack, and she took a strain on the old Lavinia Snow. Had she moved a knot, knot and a half, a little while later, 2 knot, a little while later, 2.5 knot. Yes, sir. Finally got her up to 3 knot, and they were headed off to Boston. That's as tight as that poor little vessel could do, that poor little tugboat with a Lavinia Snow. Skipper on board the tug, he looked back out through the stern windows. Sure enough, the vessel was going along. He admired it. He could see that beautiful sheer of that vessel. Isn't she a lovely, lovely schooner? And he remembered that even Howard Chappell, in one of his books, he said that Lavinia Snow was the prettiest of that particular kind of three-masted cargo carrying vessel. She was really a handsome, handsome piece. On they went all afternoon. They chugged away, trying to get to Boston as fast as they could. It was so calm. It was a weather breeder, no doubt about it, a weather breeder. It was going to come. Late in the afternoon, nighttime coming on, it was evening, sunset coming on, and a little breeze came along, a little 5 knot breeze wind came along. And 15 minutes later, it was blowing 55 knot right at the lighthouse. Oh my God, they took down whatever sails they had left and only kept a couple of rags up to help her along. It took a little bit. The old tug had all it could do to tow her in through the islands and over the ledges there until they could get in and get anchored and get away from this storm coming up. And then they got her anchored and she got all settled down there and they stripped her down for the storm coming. And look at that piece of gear. Isn't she a magnificent vessel? Look at the stern overhanging the quarters there and that beautiful semi-clipper bow. She was a wonderful schooner, all right. And she lay there in quiet comfort all through this raging gale of wind. The other vessel that the tugboat came around out at Race Point, never heard from again. All were lost. Everybody was gone. The vessel was gone itself, and they never knew what ever happened to it. So now we've got to give you a little bit of a sermon about the beautiful Sail Power Steam Museum. Just a quick one because I've used up all my time, all my commercial time, giving you the little history of the Lavinia Snow. Up in the upper left there, that's the old museum building, wonderful museum building, solid full of magnificent memorabilia now. And the two little garages that are attached to it, one is the steam house where we have all our running steam and 12 running steam engines. And the other one is the Paces chandlery where we have just a multitude of equipment for vessels, anything you want from blocks to thimbles to belaying pins all around. The whole museum is right solid full, and you've got to come and see it to believe it. The centerpiece there, the old museum full. We had to build a new building. That's our new building right there, brand new building with a flag flying. We call it the Wing and Wing building. It is a magnificent building. We have all antique boats in there, beautiful big steamboat, the Light Horseman, the vessel that discovered Penobscot Bay in 1605. We've got Beetle Cats, Herreshoff 12.5s. We've got all kinds of different vessels in there. Our active waterfront, amazing waterfront, down in the lower left, you can see the kids out there on the skiff program. Sail Kids for free. We take kids from 8 to 14 years old, give them a free week-long sail training session from Monday to Friday. They come not knowing anything about a boat. We put them in these little Optimus prams. They go out there. They learn. Their mind's a sponge at that age. They learn so quickly what the tiller's all about, what the rudder does, how the centerboard works, and where to put the sail. And they race each other. By Friday, they are true sailors. People give us things all the time. Over in the middle right-hand side there is the Morning in Maine, a 65-foot peat color catch, wonderful little vessel. She goes out on 2-hour cruises. Tyler Watterson is her captain, and he is a very entertaining guy. Show you a couple of lighthouses, show you Penobscot Bay, show you all of Rockland Harbor in 2 hours. And it's a grand thing to do this summer. Keep it on your to-do list. Every Sunday we have a jam session. People come and bring their instruments. We had 25 musicians there a couple of Sundays ago, and it's been going on summer and winter for the last 16 years. We have a great tent where we serve lobsters. We have functions there, concerts, and all kinds of different things under our tent. Now we've got to move along, and see what's up. If you want to get to Boston, well, how do you get to Boston? You got to buy a ticket. You buy a ticket from Boston to Maine, $1. Buy a ticket from Maine to Boston, $1. I'm going to turn the meeting over now to Don Wilding. He's going to tell us all the details of the Portland Gale, November 1898. Don Wilding, I guess you better share your screen. It's your watch. Thank you very
All
much.
right. Thank you, Captain. Okay, now everybody can hear me, I assume. And thank you again, Robin and Captain Jim and everybody else up in Rockland for having me here tonight. Uh, this is this story. What I'll be talking about tonight is the angle of the Portland Gale as how it affected Cape Cod. And a lot of people know this. They've heard of the Portland Gale, but they don't know what it was all about and why it was called the Portland Gale. But this occurred 125 years ago, this past November, November 26th, 27th, and it ended up being one of the, if not the deadliest storm, one of the deadliest storms to ever strike Cape Cod. And it was known very quickly as one that was for the books, as the benchmark type of storm. The Boston Sunday Post wrote a week later after that storm that it was a night to try men's souls. It was a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. It was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. So to give you an idea of how devastating this storm was and the shipwrecks that occurred around Cape Cod and across New England, during the fiscal year of 1897, there were 394 disasters nationwide. And during the Portland Gale storm alone, just in those couple of days, there were 187 wrecks that occurred. So the news of the storm, it broke out that Saturday night, November 26th, and I'll get to the whole detail about the Portland and why it was called that. But I mentioned how deadly it was, and nearly 200 people perished aboard the steamer Portland as it was bound from Boston to Portland, Maine. Excuse me. There was it was nationwide news. The news from the Cape and New England came out very, very gradually. It was news reports were not immediate as they are now. I mean, you didn't have Jim Cantori wandering the beach during this storm. This was the type of an event where it took many, many days before details started to come in. And these were some of the headlines. The Portland Daily Press, you see it there. Some of these other newspapers, the all-day search for the bodies from the Portland, which 38 of them, 37, 38, came ashore on Cape Cod. And those were the only bodies that were found from the Portland. And this was when the death toll had risen to 99 lives from the Portland on the headline of this newspaper. And then the subhead says, "Steamship dashed to pieces on the rocky shore of Cape Cod." Well, that tells me right then and there that that editor had never been to Cape Cod, because there isn't too much of in the way of rocky shores on Cape Cod. So it ended up still being a big devastating event, and it was one of those events that was remembered. And many times now people talk, especially in Massachusetts, about the blizzard of '78 and some of the other storms, more memorable storms that become benchmark. But after this storm, this was the one that everybody talked about, and they compared any other storm that came along to the Portland Gale, the storm of 1898. 30 years after that storm, the lightkeeper at Wood End Lighthouse in Provincetown he commented that there were many old timers left who are still willing and eager to settle down and begin their story. It was in '98 when the Portland went down. So at sea during the Portland, 456 lives were lost. That counts the Portland steamer, and it also counts all these other shipwrecks and other ships that left port and never returned. Um, so this was a really devastating type of weather event, and ended up being remembered for years. All named. The storm got the name the Portland Gale, not so much for the city of Portland, but for the steamer Portland, the steamship Portland, which was heading for its namesake city in Maine from Boston over Thanksgiving weekend of 1898. And this was a beautiful, state of the art vessel. I can't get into a lot of the technical details about it, but I will tell you it had almost celebrity status in Boston. Everybody knew about the Portland and what it looked like and what it was about. And it was very luxurious looking. I mean, this picture here, this was the interior of the Portland. It looked like something out of the Titanic. And it was often, the Portland disaster is often referred to as the Titanic of New England, with all the loss of life and everything. But this was, very, very beautiful interior, had a lot of luxurious staterooms. And so there were a lot of people that were just loved the idea of traveling on this. It was also one of the only forms of transportation between Boston and Portland at that time, and especially over Thanksgiving weekend, because you either had the steamers going between Boston and Portland, or you had the railroad, one or the other. This is before the airlines or anything else like that. So they were basically competing with one another. And the Portland left Boston at 7 p.m., its departed time, so its departure time, and was supposed to be heading for Portland, and it got caught up in this storm, which kicked in only roughly a little over a half an hour after after the Portland left Boston Harbor. And as it was going up along the north shore of Massachusetts, is when the storm really kicked into gear. This is when the winds picked up. They were starting to hit hurricane force. Driving snow just kept picking up in intensity. As it was moving up along the North Shore, there were sightings of it between both other vessels and even from land at one point. But as it kept getting further and further up, there were actually reports of it had lost its its lights. Uh, Many people speculated it may have lost its superstructure. And as it grew further north, near up past Gloucester, Cape Ann area, it started to go out to sea, and nobody knows exactly why. Nobody has ever determined exactly why. The best guess is it either lost control. They lost control of the vessel as it started to drift out to sea. And this was a map that was actually in the papers the following few days after the disaster, and they speculated as to what happened to it. And it's not too far off base really, but it some drifted across Massachusetts Bay and then down to, originally they thought it had run aground off of Provincetown, the Peaked Hill Bars area, or off of Truro near Highland Light. And it turns out that wasn't the case. It actually went down over Stellwagen Bank, and the remains of it are now sitting in 460 feet of water. But this is the best guess at that time as to where it ended up. So it was possibly blown out to sea by the wind. But we'll get to some more of what might have happened here. The storm itself, they knew bad weather was on the way. In this case, in fact, these were some of the weather forecasts that showed a storm coming in from the Midwest. But this was what meteorologists now would jump all over it and say bombogenesis is what they would say. The storm moving in from the Midwest, another one coming up the coast. The two of them, boom, collide together right around the area of Nantucket, just south of Nantucket. And this made for uh, a colossal weather event. And at that time, the captain of the Portland, Hollis Blanchard, had recently been promoted to captain. And he had warnings because he always checked in with the Weather Bureau. But he wasn't, this wasn't going to stop him from his appointed run that night on November 26th. There was always pressure to never cancel a passage if there was a chance to make one. They didn't want to lose any prestige. You know, the Portland didn't want to lose any prestige or the passenger fares to the competing railroad, a delay in freight delivery because the Portland was also carrying freight in addition to passengers. So Blanchard was also pretty convinced he could beat the storm up to Portland. He was telling people that on the way out. There were passengers and other maritime people who were telling him, hey, "You think you should go?" And he says, "Yes, of course. I think we can beat this." He was actually a very frequent visitor to the Weather Bureau office in Boston. He used to check in there pretty frequently. In fact, almost every day. Uh, and in fact, in the past, he had been called out by his bosses for being too careful. So they were telling him, you know, you're being too careful with all these. And but when it came to this storm, it ended up when the Portland disappeared and vanished. Who do you think they blamed initially? Hollis Blanchard. They said he defied orders, went against orders, and left. So, but a lot of people who knew Hollis Blanchard, other captains and such, were saying no, he wouldn't do that. And it was his. He would have definitely not done that. He would have. He was always being pressured to make these runs, and he had gotten in trouble for it before. So what he was getting himself into as he was leaving Boston Harbor, the Portland left India Wharf in Boston 7 p.m. As it headed out northeastward, uh, the wind started to kick in. 7:37 is when the snow began. And pretty soon the wind gusts were hitting, as they recorded a wind gust off of Highland Light of 90 miles an hour. There were 100-mile-an-hour winds in other places. The keeper of the life-saving service station at Point Allerton in Hull, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston Harbor, Joshua James, legendary in life-saving service circles. He estimated that the visibility at sea was 100 yards at best. So this is the kind of thing uh, they were up against. They couldn't really see all that much anywhere around them. And within 2 hours of that storm beginning, nearly 200 vessels from Casco Bay all the way to Martha's Vineyard were just scrambling for some sort of safe harbor. The Portland moving northeastward, it was determined that it had been swept across the bay. And a lot of people thought maybe Blanchard, this was only speculation. They could only really speculate what had happened. Uh, could he have turned back or gone into port, say at Newburyport, Massachusetts? Or maybe he was trying to reach Provincetown Harbor after he got out over the water. Uh, but either way, nobody really knew. But by Sunday morning, there were reports that maybe the Portland had been sighted off of Cape Cod. This was about 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. Now they had left Boston at 7. They should have been to Portland, Maine by this point. And at daybreak on Sunday, this is about 6 a.m., maybe a little later. Sam Fisher, he was the keeper of the Race Point life-saving station in Provincetown. From offshore, he heard what he thought were bells and whistle blasts, 4 whistle blasts he thought he heard, believed to be which he thought were the Portlands. And he couldn't really see the ship, though, after a while due to these snow squalls and sea spray. At this point, when he heard these whistle blasts, the, the storm, as it was passing over Cape Cod, had developed an eye, much like a hurricane. So there was a small clearing spot that had passed over that area, but it didn't last very long. And within minutes, the storm had kicked back into uh, high velocity again and high velocity winds and all. And so at this point, he couldn't see it. Fisher had his crew ready to get into a surf boat and go out and try to rescue some people. But then they lost sight of it, whatever it was, or they didn't hear anything. So they decided to wait for further anything to hear of anything else. There was also a story of as the Portland was drifting across Cape Cod Bay. I stumbled upon this piece of research from the Brewster Historical Society on Cape Cod. And there was a three-masted schooner called the Mary A. Tyler. It was heading from Maine to New York. Captain Alan Bragg from North Carolina frequently did this sort of thing. And yes, he is related to the family of Fort Bragg, who that was named for. But Captain Bragg, many years after the storm, he was going across, he was right in the area of Cape Cod Bay, just maybe northwest of Provincetown. And he told his daughter many years later that he passed so close to the Portland that he could have touched it, but he couldn't help them and they couldn't help him. And he had his own little adventure, which I'll tell you about later on in the program. But he claims to have seen it. A lot of other people, though, they just say nobody really knows what became of it. But it was eventually swept, which most people believe happened. It was swept under by the waves. 7:30 Sunday night of November 27th, a surfman named John Johnson from that Race Point station recovered a life preserver, and it had these letters on it, STR Portland, while he was out on patrol. The life-saving service used to have several men who would go out on patrol every night in search of ships in distress. And Johnson came back and he said, "Hey, I found this life preserver and it says Steamer Portland on it." So a lot of what they had feared was what might have happened actually happened. Much more debris started coming up in the next few hours. And then at 2:20 in the morning, November 28th, the first body is discovered at the High Head Life Saving Station in North Truro. This is probably about 7 or 8 miles southeast of Race Point, along the outer beach of the Cape. And then at Cahoon Hollow in Wellfleet, the first identified body, one of Portland's crew members, is recovered. And over the next few hours, several more bodies begin to wash up on the beaches of the Cape. Most of them, some came ashore initially at Provincetown, Truro, Wellfleet, but then more and more of them, as the bodies began to wash ashore, were more down in the area of Nauset Beach, Chatham, down in that area, because that's the way the currents were going from that area of Stellwagen Bank down towards Chatham. And it's believed that many of these bodies might have been swept around Chatham, Monomoy, and into Nantucket Sound, never to be seen again. These, like I said before, 38 bodies were the ones recovered. There were no others of the almost 200 people aboard. They don't know what happened to them. They don't know if they're still down in the Portland, what's left of it, or if they were just swept away and taken somewhere else. So that's still a mystery to this day. Many of those bodies, as I mentioned, in pieces of wreckage too, came ashore in the Nauset area, East Ham and Orleans area, and this was written by the historian Alice Lowe, Nauset on Cape Cod in East Ham, and talked about the carting of bodies to the railroad station and distressed relatives waiting anxiously in the Cape towns for loved ones to be released from the angry seas. And this too I will talk about a little bit more further on. But a lot of the bodies they found that had watches on them, this is the time that they found on their watches that they had, somewhere in the area of 9:15 to 10 o'clock. Whether it was AM or PM, no one really seems to be sure. I personally think it was probably in the AM, Sunday morning, not too long after they heard those four whistle blasts. But again, nobody has really been sure of that. But with the 38 bodies that washed ashore on, this is 30 miles along the outer beach of Cape Cod, at least where these bodies came ashore. And this is just a list of some of the people that that were the victims that were washed ashore. You see some places in England or Quebec, but also Turner, Maine, Yarmouth, Maine, Portland, Maine. Just some of the victims that were found in Eastham. And very shortly after I first wrote about the Portland, I used to write a history column for the Cape Codder newspaper in Orleans on the Cape. And I wrote about the Portland back in 2015. And a gentleman wrote to me the following week, and he said my great grandmother talked about the Portland when I was young, and talked about the bodies that they found on the beach in Eastham. And there was a funeral home on Bridge Road in South Eastham that was full, and the ground was frozen, so they had to keep a lot of bodies in a barn in the back before they could really do anything with them because the ground was frozen. There were no survivors, according to everything that's been written about the Portland. They never found any survivors. However, there is this one story that emerged from the Nauset area. There was a body that washed ashore, and there was a surfman that was out on patrol. And as he was going up, walking along the beach, he's walking along and he sees a body laying there. And he bends down and he turns over the body, expecting that this man is dead. Well, according to this story, the man's alive. The man is alive. And the surfman is shocked to see this. And he starts to turn and run to get help. And supposedly the man who's laying there says, "For God's sake, don't leave me." And well, the life-saving service surfman runs to get help. And by the time he gets back, the guy is dead. Didn't make it. Now, if there's any truth to this story, if the man was still alive and could talk and tell what had happened, he'd be the only one that could have told what really happened in the case of the Portland. He was, but in this case, I find it hard to believe, a lot of other people do too, that he could have survived in the water in late November in these conditions with 60-foot waves. And he was said to be a very good swimmer even. But as he was, if he made it 20, this would be about 20 miles at least in the water before he washes ashore. It's kind of hard to believe, but this is how the story goes that came out of Eastham, and that they found this guy. But either way, we'll never know. Well, it was a mystery for many years as to what had happened or where was the Portland. But they actually found parts of the Portland over near Stellwagen Bank in March of 1899, just a few months later. There was a fishing schooner called the Maud S. The Maud S was actually had actually seen the Portland on the night of November 26th, just off the North Shore of Massachusetts. And the Maud had actually pulled up parts of wreckage near Stellwagen Bank, and uh, they brought all this stuff to the Portland steamship steam packet company, and they evaluated it. The people of the Portland company evaluated it and said, no doubt, this belongs to the Portland. And all these fixtures and everything, they said it was a match. This seems to have been forgotten over the years, many, many years. And in fact, you had the historian Edward Rose Snow had launched many expeditions to try to find the Portland. He did find other shipwrecks, never found the Portland. He was also instrumental in the development of the Portland Associates Group, which was the relatives and descendants of the victims of the Portland disaster, who would meet on Cape Cod every year for many, many years until finally the descendants also passed on. Snow was instrumental in that. If you go to Highland Light, too, in Truro, there's a sign that is posted right at the lighthouse that also mentions the Portland. And the vessel was finally located in 1989 in 460 feet of water in the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary off of Massachusetts. Now, remember, this is federal marine sanctuary, so you technically cannot go disturb anything there. So that's why nobody's gone inside the Portland. Yes, they've had people go down there and look, and they've taken images on the surface of the ruins of the Portland. It was a group that first located it from Bourne on the Cape, the Historical Maritime Group of New England, led by John P. Fish and H. Arnold Carr. These two men, I've talked with both of them on a couple of occasions, and they were shipwreck hunters, still are, and they were the ones who first determined that yes, this is the Portland, and they used that actual newspaper clipping to help find it from 1899. Also in 2002 is when the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary and Klein Sonar Associates took these images of the Portland in 2002. So it's sitting there. It's still sitting there. So the Portland steamer, though, was only part of the story of this entire disaster. Out in Provincetown, which was actually the closest to where the Portland went down, Provincetown had its own share of horrors that occurred. There was a young woman named Annie Newcomb who had written a composition for her English class in Provincetown. And she said that she wrote that men who had vessels which were expected to be unfit for further use as they were being driven ashore were crying. Women who had relatives out at sea were weeping, and children were crying for fear of being washed away. This was a devastating storm, particularly in Provincetown. You might have heard of some of the recent storms that have hit Provincetown, how Commercial Street has been flooded. That's what happened here during the Portland Gale. There was 5 feet of water in some parts of Provincetown during that storm. But also the shipwrecks that occurred in this normally safe harbor was particularly rough. There were 2 ships from Rockland, the Lester A. Lewis and the Jordan Mott, which were among the wrecked ships. There were about 3 dozen ships that had been in distress in Provincetown Harbor during the storm. And this kept the Wood End station particularly busy. It's out in here, that's out on pretty much the extreme tip of Provincetown. And Isaac Fisher and his crew took 10 hours to reach these 2 ships, the Lewis and the Mott, pulling a surfboat through snow and getting through a 50-foot wide channel of water that had broken through the barrier beach there. So this is an area it's really not all that far away. It's probably a mile and a half maybe, to the location where the Mott and the Lewis were half submerged in the water, and it took them 10 hours to work it through. Actually, the Lester Lewis was from Bangor, and the Jordan Mott was from Rockland. They both had 5-man crews, and they all stayed on board as they were stuck here in the harbor fighting off the storm. And by Sunday night, 6 of these 10 men had frozen to death. And there were many other boats piling up in the west end of town too there. This is the same area where the Mayflower anchored back when the Pilgrims first landed in Provincetown Harbor. So the surf also was backed up almost to the back door of the Wood End Station, which is also right out in that area. The Mott was sunk to her upper works. The captain and the ship's cabin boy, they were nearly dead. And their companions on board actually had been beating on them just to keep them from freezing. And Captain Dyer's father, who was the steward, was already dead. His body was encrusted with snow. And the lifesavers ended up removing 4 survivors. And the Lester Lewis, upwind from the Mott, had only its deckhouse and its masts above the water. 4 men in the rigging, no signs of life. And another one was frozen inside the cabin of the boat. So the men that were saved were brought ashore. They were okay eventually. And as the storm passed, and the tide went out, and the scene, and this was the scene in Provincetown Harbor afterwards, and they actually had to finally go out and cut down these frozen men from the rigging of the Jordan Mott. And this woman, who was identified by the newspapers as Mrs. Henry Spears, watched from her window. She lived right near the harbor, and she watches all these men being cut down. And from that time on, she kept the shades drawn on every window that faced the harbor. She just couldn't look out there anymore after that particular day. So meanwhile, on the outer beach, there were all kinds of other vessels. Part of the Addie snow from Maine washed ashore at Race Point, as Captain Jim mentioned. This was only identified by its medicine, I believe its medicine cabinet. And eventually the family had finally come to Race Point to had heard about it, that they had found it. They were actually led to believe that they were safe because they had seen a false newspaper report before that. And so eventually they went to Race Point and found that confirmed everything that they had feared. There was also the story of the schooner Albert L. Butler, which came ashore at the Peaked Hill Bar Station. This is on the far back shore of Provincetown. And the Butler was carrying logwood from Jamaica to Boston. And this could be called your typical shipwreck almost on Cape Cod, but there were so many of them during this storm. This was one of them. The Butler was only about 50 yards from shore, which is actually relatively close, but they were still being pounded by waves, and the incoming surf was just incredible. There were huge waves that were coming in. And so the Peaked Hill Life Saving Station was called into action, and they were nearby. And they had to use their apparatus, which was they would either use a surfboat or the breeches buoy. And in this case, they had to use the breeches buoy. If you're not familiar with what a breeches buoy is, it's kind of they use a cannon, very small cannon that was called the Lyle gun. And they would have a one of these metal projectiles that was also inside the cannon attached to a box that was called a faking box. It was filled with several hundred yards of rope that they would tie to it and fire it, and hopefully get it over the rigging of and the masts of the ship, and that somebody on board was in good enough shape to tie it, fasten it, and then they would have these leather pants almost that you could step into and get on board, and it was like a nice ride into over the waves to get back to shore. Well, in this case, the men on board, the butler, didn't know how to use this, so they just took the rope, and the first guy jumped into the water. Well, they pulled him ashore, and he made it. And then the other guys on board, two of the other guys on board tried it. They were swept away by a 20-foot wave. They couldn't make it. So after all of that, the waves calmed down later on. Tide goes out, and they see smoke coming from the cabin of the butler. And two men come out of the cabin. They'd been hiding there the whole time. And they were probably the smart ones, just stayed in there. One of them came out. This was straight out of a pirate movie almost. He had a big parrot on his shoulder. And they come ashore, and the parrot apparently had quite the salty vocabulary. And they were talking about it, and the guy says, "I'll tell you though, that bird was right." He says that storm was a real humdinger. So the Provincetown was one of those areas where there were just so much devastation. Another place where ships were tossed around like toys was in Vineyard Haven, out on Martha's Vineyard. Tossed like toys was the headline in the Boston Globe, called the most eventful day that Vineyard Haven had seen in over 40 years. 50 coasters were thrown around the harbor. Half of them washed ashore. 10 men drowned. A British schooner was driven into the wharf near the Seamen's Bethel there. There were also two lime schooners that had come from Maine. And one thing I didn't realize before I started researching this for this book was that lime, when it gets wet, ignites, catches fire. Well, that's what happened here. Two of these ships caught fire. One of them stayed there and was still there in the harbor, burning from November 27th until December 19th. That's how long it was burning in the water. And then another one, men were on board the burning lime schooner, and as they were trying to figure out, as the ship is being thrown around, they're saying to themselves, what do we do? Do we stay on this ship and burn, or do we jump off and drown? Well, just their luck, as they were being thrown around, they got thrown right next to another ship that was being tossed around but wasn't on fire. So they were able to jump off that and save themselves. So it made for some pretty wild stories that came out of Martha's Vineyard, and that was just a couple of them. But in both places, whether it was Martha's Vineyard or out on the Cape, there were just a lot of stories about the heroic efforts of the life-saving service, because they were at it from, for instance, there were some from the Gay Head station on Martha's Vineyard who were busy. They were on duty continuously from I believe it was 11 o'clock on Saturday night until 5 p.m. on Monday afternoon, just trying to save people that were in some sort of shipwreck dilemma. And it was reported by the Portland Daily Press that these men worked like fiends, was the efforts of the surfmen. The sand would cut their faces until it was raw and bleeding. I don't know if you've ever walked out on the beach during a windy day, and you could feel maybe the sand blowing against your legs, and you're like, "Oh, that hurts." Well, imagine being out in a 90 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour, having all that sand blowing in your face. It does. It starts to cut you. It's like strokes of a whiplash, was what the life-saving service report had said. And this really wore and stretched out the men of the life-saving service. Uh, they were exhausted by just trying to cover their beats and completely unnerved by finding these torn and sea-washed bodies that would come ashore. Because what happens to a body, I have a pretty thorough description of what happens to a body when it's in the water, when it's in the ocean for that long. It's really kind of gruesome, but this is what they were finding. And some of these bodies didn't have heads, or some of them were missing other body parts. It was not. It was really tough on these men to find these kind of things. They were made almost nervous wrecks from this sort of thing. One of the surfmen, a fellow named Ben Eldridge, said it was a terrible week we had spent. Sometimes we could just see a hand sticking up out in the sand. And when we dug, of course, he said we exposed the body that way. And one of the lifesavers' duties was to transport the bodies to the proper authorities for burial. So a reporter asks one of the Peaked Hill Bars surfmen in Provincetown about this, and he told gruesome details of finds he had made and the method of carrying the dead to the station. And he was asked, well, isn't that rather hard on the nerves? And his answer was, well, we can't think about that. They're somebody's friends. So they had to, try to keep themselves composed. And it was said by the Boston Sunday Post the following week, nigh 300 souls were lost on that awful night. But you did your best. You are the heroes of the blizzard. Some of you toiled all night alone. Some of you walked up and down the wreck-strewn beaches. Some manned the boats. Some succored the saved at the station houses. All are heroes. And it wasn't just them, the surfmen of the life-saving service, who turned in all these heroic efforts. There were also volunteers from people who lived on the Cape and on Martha's Vineyard who helped out. In this case was the story of Robert Lavender, Captain Robert Lavender of Provincetown. He was a seafaring veteran, and he and several other men were awarded the Congressional Medal for Bravery after they rescued a fellow named William Forrest from the rigging of a schooner called the F.H. Smith in Provincetown Harbor. Lavender saw this man in trouble, goes out among a crowd of all these other sea captain and sailing veterans that he knew, and sought out help in a crowd. He says, men, we know there's one out there in the rigging. It's a life, mates, and I'm going to try to get at it. I call for volunteers. And Lavender and 10 men dig up this leaky old boat from a boatyard in Provincetown. They fix it up enough so that it can get out. As they're going out, a wave knocks them over, knocks Lavender out of the boat, and he says, keep going. He says, I'll make sure, all right. And they say, yeah, right, like the devil you will. And they pull him back on board. People on shore are cheering their efforts. The mast is about to topple on this ship out in the harbor as Lavender and his crew got to them, and they said, just told them, swing clear of the shrouds and gear and let go. We'll take care of you. So he drops into the ocean, and they pulled him into the rescue boat, brought him ashore. So that was just some of the local volunteers' efforts. And then there was the media, the people who had to report on this. And at this point now, there were only newspaper reporters, really. There were no TV people or anything like that. No TV reporters standing on the beach like this, trying to hold up their microphones and not be blown away. These guys were, they had to get very creative when it came to ways of getting their story into the papers. And in Boston, there were a couple of Boston reporters out there. One of them was a local correspondent on the Cape. He worked for the Boston Herald. His name was Charles Ward, and he was based in Chatham. And he had intercepted a piece of a telegraph message that came from Highland Light to Hyannis about the Portland, that it was the Portland. And nobody had really heard anything about what had happened to the Portland at this point. This was a couple of days after the storm. And Ward starts to piece all this information together. He gets this telegraph message and a few other pieces of information, and he says, "Well, how am I going to get this? All the phone lines on the Cape are down, so he couldn't call this story in. So he had to bring it to Boston. Also, the train tracks were out on the Cape. A lot of them, some of them had been washed out by high tides, so they couldn't really get off Cape. And Ward got on what they called a work train. They put together this one train to get people as far as they could westward. Well, when they got to East Sandwich, they couldn't go any further, and Ward had to get off and walk from there. So he walked all the way through to the center of Sandwich, knocks on a farmer's door, borrows a horse, rides to Buzzards Bay. Now, this is before the Cape Cod Canal. So there were just a couple of rivers there, and that was it. There was no bridges or anything like that. So he was able to just ride right into Buzzards Bay, catches another train from Buzzards Bay into Boston, gets to Boston. This poor guy is just totally exhausted. He delivers the news to his office, gets up the stairs. And he's even on the train with another reporter, doesn't say anything to him about it, about what the scoop that he has. And he finally climbs the stairs to the Herald office, even sees people in the office as he walks in, still doesn't say anything, gets into his editor's office, tells him what he has, and then he passes out. So and then he's revived. His editor is hanging over him with a couple of shots of whiskey to try to get him going. And he finally gets everything out, and he's got his story in. He made $500 for it, which was a pretty good payday back then. And he broke this big story to the world, and the Herald put out the special edition about the Portland, all lost aboard the Portland. Well, they had not found many of the names or anything yet. So a little further down, a little later in the week, a whole bunch of reporters had gotten to the Cape at this point, and another storm hits. Again, the lines are down. They can't call anything in. Well, a whole bunch of reporters are in Orleans. They kind of made their headquarters there. Frank Stanion from the Boston Globe was one of them, and he has a story. He has names of people that were aboard, and he has to find a way to get his story to Boston. Well, he can't do it. So while all the reporters are, getting eating and drinking at the Shattuck House in Orleans, figuring, hey, we don't have to do anything. There's no phone service. Well, Stanion figures out a way. He walks back out into the snow, and he's walking around in Orleans, and and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Orleans, but he was walking in the area that is now Route 28, kind of up the street from where the Christmas tree shop used to be. But anyway, he's walking through this area, and he walks past this building, and he can hears the click of a telegraph key. Well, he goes in and he looks and he goes up to the door, and it's a telegraph station. It's the French cable station that ran from Orleans to Canada, and then all the way across the Atlantic to France. So this was an undersea cable. So this is how a lot of communication went on between the two continents in those days. And they weren't doing much in the way of business either that night because their telegraph line into New York was down. So the superintendent there, a guy named Hugh Osborne, tells him to come on in, and Stanion tells him what he needs, and they figure this out. Here's what they did. They sent the message from Orleans on the Cape to St. Pierre and Miquelon, these two islands that are off of the coast of Newfoundland. And these also played a prominent role during Prohibition, but that's another story. Um, then under the Atlantic Ocean to Brest, France, then to London, and then from London via postal service to Ireland, then roughly 2,500 miles to Nova Scotia, and then down the coast of New England into Boston. That's how they got their story into Boston. And he too did pretty well in getting his story out. And then many other uh, media people too were finding ways to get to the Cape. A lot of towboats arrived. 2 towboats arrived from Boston that were filled with newspapermen. Provincetown is full of it all at once. There's all these reporters, and they would talk to anybody that would say anything, just so they have a story to bring back. And there were only 2 hotels in town in Provincetown at that point. A few more there now, but those 2 hotels were filled. And some of these other reporters too would hire horse and carriage teams for transportation to get around the Cape, because Provincetown was even more remote in those days than it is now. They, especially going out to these life-saving stations in Provincetown and Truro. And one of the reporters from the Portland Daily Press was he went into one of the undertaking rooms in Provincetown, and there was this body of a woman who was thought to be about 50 years old, and he said she had a cruel cut on her head. Evidently, it was caused by the contact with a piece of wreckage while in the water after the steamer had broken up. And he said these tales were sickening and painful to listen to. We could not but shudder at the terrific tales of this horrible storm. And then there were relatives of those aboard the Portland who were coming to the Cape by train when they could finally fix the train tracks a few days afterwards during that week. And people were coming from all over, and a lot of these people were coming from Maine. Some didn't. Many were searching for their kin. Some found the bodies. Some didn't find relatives at all. Railroad tracks had been washed out in both Truro and Sandwich, so this closed off service to the Cape for several days after the storm. A town neck in the Sandwich Sagamore area, right at the beginning of the Cape, 3 to 4 miles of track were washed out, as was 300 feet of track in West Barnstable. It was reported that a tidal wave, so it's more like a storm surge, I'm sure, crossed the railroad track and covered parts of Main Street Sandwich with 3 to 4 feet of water, and a lot of fish houses were wrecked, and one of them was stranded on the railroad track. You can see on this picture on the left. And this is also just this lopsided railroad track that had been just almost turned over by the waves that came in Sandwich. And this is downtown Sandwich. Churches damaged, houses unroofed, streets were impassable from falling trees that had been there. A lot of livestock was lost, a lot of flooding. And also, I mentioned a lot of the families that came down. One of them was a fellow from Portland, Maine. His name was Fred Hooper. And Hooper had come to the Cape, and he had a real hard time just getting to Provincetown, just because of the trains and some of the places where he had to get off the train, had to get a stagecoach kind of ride to the next part of the track. And then it took him forever to get out to Provincetown. Well, Hooper was looking for both his father and his brother, who were on board the Portland. He went into the undertaker's rooms in Provincetown, Orleans, Chatham, walked up 12 miles of beach with the life-saving service on the outer Cape. Nothing was found of either one of his father or brother. The day after he left Orleans, his father's body washed up on the beach in Orleans. So and these bodies were not all at once. Some of them were coming, days or even weeks afterwards. So it was, it was quite a horrific scene for everybody. It was also horrific for a lot of families on the Cape, people who uh, sea captains and sailors that had gone to sea during the storm and never returned. One such story was that of Captain John Garfield of West Dennis. Uh, he was he and both Mark Holmes, another captain of Connecticut from Connecticut, they were dining together in Philadelphia on November 22nd. And over the years, they'd become pretty good friends, and they were both about to embark on another coal run. This is what they did. They owned these ships, and they would run coal between Philadelphia and New England ports. Well, some 96 hours after that dinner, the two mariners were together once again, only not in a manner they really expected. Both were lashed to the masts of their respective ships, dead at the bottom of the ocean off Montauk Point, New York. Garfield was 36 years old. He's captain of the three-masted schooner James B. Pace, and Holmes was master of the Howard M. Hanscom. So on November 24th, both of these vessels are being loaded with coal. Garfield and the Pace are going to Boston. Holmes and the Hanscom are going to Providence. These two would often sail together. And the fate of both of them remained a mystery for over a year. The December 1898 edition of the New York Maritime Register reported the Pace as overdue, followed by several months of missing status. Garfield had a wife and two children back in West Dennis. The first mate, Danny Nickerson, he had a wife and an 8-month-old son in Dennisport. And as the days and weeks passed, any optimism for the Pace's survival was fading pretty quickly. And then in December of 1899, government divers were investigating navigational obstructions at the bottom of the seas off Montauk Point. They discovered the Pace and the Hanscom. And the Maritime Register gave these details, said in both vessels, the divers report that skeletons of men were found lashed to the rigging or to the rails of the vessels. And while there's nothing left of the flesh, it is thought they could be recognized by the clothing. That's the only way they knew who it was. And then there were survivors. I mentioned this fellow earlier, Captain Alan Bragg of North Carolina. You might have heard the term wash ashore for Cape Cod. This usually applies to people who move there and live there. I mean, heck, even the Pilgrims could have been described as wash ashores, or any of the early settlers. Nowadays, it's if you've lived offshore for a long, I mean, anywhere else for a long time, and then you move to Cape Cod, you're called the wash ashore. Well, then there were people who actually washed ashore. There's many stories of them, but this one, particularly the Portland Gale, was that of Captain Alan Bragg. Alan Bragg, captain of the Mary A. Tyler, carrying a load of paper between Maine and New York. His ship, the Mary A. Tyler, broke in two and stranded near Paynes Creek in Brewster. This is on the bay side of the Cape, kind of near the. You look at Cape Cod this way, it would be right around this area, and they were their ship breaking in half. Bragg and the crew climb up in the rigging. This is something that shipwreck victims would often do. Their last chance at survival. Their ship might be half submerged, and the only thing sticking up is the masts. So they would climb up, and fortunately for Bragg and his crew, they were rescued by some men from Brewster, Captain Jeremiah Wixon and several other men. This was the description that was provided by his daughter in 1971 to the Brewster Historical Society. Grimly, he and his men worked to keep their own ship afloat. Just before night fell, as the terrifically high and pounding waters off Cape Cod, his boat broke in two, the forecastle remaining just enough above water to allow the men to try, but in vain, to light a blaze, however small, for warmth by pouring kerosene on coal. They had a few water-soaked soda crackers, but they were too frozen and sick to eat. They tied themselves together with rope, and after hours of struggling with the wind and the icy deck, managed to lash themselves to the mast. All during the frozen night of horror, the wind whipped the mast into the sea, tossing it up and down as though it were more than a splinter, freezing them to it. Their clothes were iced to their bodies. They were vomiting and nearly unconscious. The wind abated somewhat toward morning, and after daybreak, they were sighted from shore. And Captain Bragg also told his daughter many years later that for a long, long time the tides brought in rolls of paper from his wrecked ship, which the natives gathered, dried, and used. I was told that the Brewster School newspaper was printed on this paper for this rolled up paper for many, many years. And a few years later, about 6 years later, Captain Bragg married the daughter of his rescuer. He married Margaret Wixon, daughter of Jeremiah Wixon, and they lived in Brewster for the rest of their lives. Uh, Bragg stayed there, but his adventurous life at sea didn't end with that 1898 Gale. During World War I, he was a lieutenant commander for the Navy, led some of the biggest transports of the conflict, and during World War II, he worked for the government as a civilian in charge of a Michigan shipyard, which built small boats. And his memory lives on at the Captain's Golf Course in Brewster, where the second hole on the starboard course is named for him. There was also the medical examiner who was kept extremely busy during those couple of weeks after the storm. His name was Dr. Samuel Davis, referred to as an untiring official who had to pretty much handle every body they found. And he also had to deal with everybody who was coming down there searching for bodies. So for those searching, Davis had requested from them photographs, full description, age, color, hair, and eyes, whether they had a beard or mustache, marks on the body, jewelry, clothing, anything that could help. And it had to be attached to the picture. He said letters had been pouring in at the rate of 100 a day. Requests for information tell of the tremendous sorrow that the entire New England states are weighed down under. Wherever Davis went to on the Cape in those couple of weeks after, he was followed by reporters everywhere. And he built up a pretty good relationship with these reporters because he had a job to do. He had to get the word out, and he knew how to utilize the media to get this job done. So he was the one that urged authorities also to move these bodies to Boston as soon as possible. And it also created quite a hectic scene at the Orleans train station. And also from Orleans, there was a fellow named Rufus Snow. Rufus Snow was a weekender at Sand City. This is one of the cottage colonies overlooking Nauset Beach at the time. He actually recovered a big 6-foot double steering wheel with 200 feet of line attached to it around Nauset Beach. And he took this all around New England, exhibited it in Boston, then he brought it up to Maine. And apparently it was seized by the Portland Steam Packet Company, and they had it destroyed because it hurt their business. So he was not able to keep his souvenir. There are other wheels, though, from the Portland that are in other museums. Centerville Historical Society has one of the actual steering wheel, and there actually was another one too that was brought ashore and was kept by the man who found it. And one of the local organizations on the Cape came to the house one day, and they saw that there, and a guy who was affiliated with them anyway, and saw that wheel and said, one of the wheels, and said, where's that from? And they said, it's from the Portland. And the lifesaver who found it said, his wife said, I wish he'd get rid of that thing. And so the guy from the Historical Society took it, much to her delight. And the last story I have, one of the last stories, actually, is another one of the bodies that was found. A woman, I believe she was from Maine. Her name has not been identified. I barely was able to identify the uh, man who found the body. His name was Clarence Rogers. He was about 20 years old, lived in Orleans, right near Nauset Beach. And he was out walking one day on Nauset Beach or that area in Orleans. And he's walking down the beach and he spots the body of a young woman, probably about his age, maybe a little younger, wearing only a white nightgown and a black stocking. Uh, and he is stunned by this. So he takes off his coat. It's a relatively mild day after the storm, and covers the body with a coat. Then he runs back into town to the local undertaker's office, and the undertaker gets the cart out, and Clarence rides along back to the beach. And it was said that for some strange reason, perhaps because the victim was so near his own age, perhaps because the discovery had been his, happening held for him a horrible fascination. And back at the undertaker's office, their local officials are trying to figure out who this girl is. A casket was chosen, and it was chosen by Clarence. And they said, well, if that's the way youth sees it, why not? That was their reasoning, and they accepted that choice. Well, finally, the relatives from Maine showed up to Orleans and to claim the body. And they didn't particularly like the casket choice that Clarence had made. They chose another one. And so throughout the winter, Clarence would stop by the undertaker's office on occasion to regretfully view the casket. And later that winter, Clarence got sick. He came down with a cold, and that grew into pneumonia. And then shortly after that, he died. And following his death, they had to choose a casket for him. And everybody agreed that the coffin he had selected for the young victim of the wreck, was the most appropriate one in which to bury him. He was laid to rest in a tomb, according to the local newspapers. And for several days after the funeral, the family dog would show up at the cemetery and lie down at the entrance at the door of the tomb, waiting for his master to wake up. So it was one of those things that another sad story that came out from the Portland. And there was also a poem that was written about the steamer Portland. It's called The Loss of the Steamer Portland, written by Captain Frederick Eldridge and hydrographer George Eldridge of Chatham. No, they are not related. The 326-word poem opens with the lines, on the 27th of November in the year of 98, a northeast blizzard swept the sea, death following in its wake. That summer, that song it became a song. They actually wrote music for it. Made a pretty big impact on a visitor from New York. His name was E.W. Blanchard. He was the brother of the Portland captain, Hollis Blanchard. He was staying at the Monomoyuk Inn in Chatham. Blanchard drove around town with George Eldridge, and Eldridge sang to him the song of the Portland, which the Chatham Monitor said affected him very much. And back to Annie Newcomb's composition again, pretty much summed up the impact that the Portland had on New England and everybody, especially on Cape Cod. The terrible event which rested so heavily on the hearts of many and which will not soon depart. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in here tonight, and for Sail Power and Steam Museum for having me. My next effort will be my fifth book, which is due out on May 20th of this year. It is called Historic Storms of Cape Cod. It will be everything pretty much after the Portland Gale that hit Cape Cod. That includes the 1938 hurricane, 1944, the hurricanes of 54, Um, the blizzard of '78, the nor'easter of 1987, the Hurricane Bob, and the perfect storm, just to name a few. And there were several others also included in there. So those will all be included in this book. Uh, these books are available through my website as well. These are three of them, my previous books. There's Cape Cod and the Portland Gale, also Shipwrecks of Cape Cod and Brief History of Eastham. Uh, so that concludes my part of the presentation.
Well, isn't that wonderful, Don? God, it's
Well, thank you.
incredible.
Thank you, Captain.
Just absolutely
I,
incredible. It makes you want to buy a farm in Arizona. Why
you
would
want to get
anybody
away
go?
from this weather? Sure,
Why
certainly.
would anybody go to sea? Gee, that's really terrific. But gosh, you certainly covered it. I can't imagine it being covered any better than that. Wonder if we can share the screen again.
Anybody have any questions for Don? I had an interesting text from somebody the other day that their father had one of the medicine cabinet doors off the Portland and had donated it to the Farnsworth Art Museum. Not quite sure why the Farnsworth Art Museum, but I just texted a friend of mine who works over there and asked her. She's going to check on it tomorrow, see if she can figure out where that is.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, hey, John.
Do you have any artifacts at the Sail Power Steam Museum from the Portland, or any models, or what can you tell us? Anything there?
We have our shipwreck room, and in our shipwreck room, we have a large model of the Portland,
Wow.
and photos of her laying on the bottom from the story of their finding the wreck. So we do have those in there.
But you've got a model. Is it a baby one, or how big is it?
It's probably 3 feet long.
Oh my God.
It's pretty large. It's in a big case in our shipwreck room. So yeah, it's interesting. Let's see if somebody in the chat room here.
She was a beautiful vessel.
She was. I wish there were more pictures of her interior. She was quite luxurious at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the stories, Don, I don't know if you heard this story while we're waiting for Jim. I think he has some photos of some other of the boats that were lost, is what he was trying to show. But one of the other there were two boats. There was the Portland that was going Boston to Portland, and simultaneously there would be a boat coming back in the other direction. And the Portland was the newer, more luxurious one. And
the other one was the Bay State.
Yeah, and the captain of the Portland was very experienced, had gone up through the ranks from a young guy, wasn't formally trained. The guy in the boat in Portland coming down was much younger, had been to a maritime academy. And my understanding was that the captain on the Portland was he was kind of show the other guy that he could do it because he had all the experience. And the other guy actually stopped his trip and canceled the trip from Portland to Boston.
He didn't go. He declined to go, or it's kind of unclear as to who told who what.
Yeah. Sure, there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking. Here's Jim is coming back in. Here he comes.
Oh, good.
We still on the air?
There he is. We're still here. We've been telling stories, Jim. You want to give it one more try?
Well, I don't think I can get it up, whatever it is.
Okay. Well, maybe you'd like to say thank yous, and then we'll close it out.
Yes, I think that's probably a good idea. I did want to say, want to thank everybody for the whole operation here. It's a fantastic thing. Wanted to remind you that our website, sailpowersteammuseum.org, you can go and see all of these 25 or 30 of these Zoom programs we've done so far. And we don't have quite as much difficulty with some of them as it has with the ending of this one. It was a grand program, and thank you all for coming. Come down to the museum, see us, buy a book, look around the museum, learn all about our maritime history in Rockland. And thank you all for coming.
And check our calendar. If on our website, you can sign up. If you didn't sign up when you registered for this, you can sign up for our newsletter. We only send it out once a month. We don't spam people, but we continue these. These are going through March, these talks. We have all sorts of great talks coming up. Shipwrecks of Penobscot Bay. We've got a bunch of different things coming up. So you can check our website, or you can sign up for our newsletter too.
You people had quite the storm surge, didn't you, just this past week? Very much like the Portland Gale, I heard, up in Maine.
Yeah, we had back to back, one on the 10th and one on the 13th.
Not quite. We had a 15-foot tide.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
We didn't have the breeze wind that they had in the Portland Gale.
Something.
Yeah. But thank you for asking. Any other questions out there?
Raise your hand if somebody's got a question, or wave high. Everybody wave high.
Yeah.